Hello Tributes and welcome to part 3 of the 195th Hunger Games. Before we begin, I would like to apologize because I noticed earlier today actually that I did not thank Andrew McLean, Christian Blanco, and Lauren McCouch for everything they do in this series. I didn't do that in the first part. So, to make up for that, I'm going to do it in this part 4, part 5, and part 6. I'm going to do it in the remaining parts. I'm going to do it before I do anything in those 4 remaining parts, and I'll link their stuff in the description. But anyways, thank you, Christian, Blanco, and Lauren McCouch for inspiring this series. Without y'all, this series would not exist. And thank you, Andrew McLean, for producing a lot of the art used in this series. So anyways, their links will be down below. Anyways, let's get into part 3 of the 195th Hunger Games. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the mentors escorted their tributes to their launch tubes. As the tributes were being taken to their launch tubes, some mentors passed by each other and talked in hushed tones about plans for Almenio. In Charlotte's launch room, Charlotte softly sobbed into her hands until Avia came into the launch room. When Avia arrived, she talked to Charlotte about how she had pretty high chances of victory, being one of the older tributes in the arena. Charlotte had her doubts, but she nodded in agreement before being pushed into her tube. As the glass closed around her, Charlotte gave Avia a terrified look before looking up as the light of the arena snuck into her launch tube. In Ronan's launch room, he paced back and forth, waiting for Simon to arrive. When Simon arrived, he hugged Ronan. Ronan and Simon talked about strategy in the bloodbath and how he could possibly use his size to win. After a few moments, Simon pushed Ronan into his launch tube, and watched the glass close around him. In Archibald's launch room, he was not visited by anyone. Avia and Simon were busy with Charlotte and Ronan. After a few minutes, a peacekeeper came to Archibald and told him to get into his launch tube. Archibald sighed and did this, watching the glass close around him. In Delara's launch room, Delara was still terrified after what had happened the previous day. When Arsenica came into the launch room, she hugged Delara tight. Arsenica and Delara stayed in this hug for a while until the peacekeeper told Arsenica to say goodbye to Delara. Arsenica did this and ushered Delara into her launch tube. As Delara rose into the arena, Arsenica waved goodbye at Delara once more. In Delara's room, Delara paced back and forth, still terrified about the previous day's events. Delara wasn't visited by anyone, as Arsenica was visiting Delara and Almenio was in prison. As Delara waited, he took a look at the arena clothing offered to him in the room. He then correctly guessed by the look of the clothing that this arena was going to be an outdoor arena. After a few minutes, a peacekeeper told Delara to get into his launch tube. As he watched the glass close around him, Delara put on a determined look. In Anya's launch room, she was slightly scared after what had happened to Araminta the day before. Anya hoped to see Araminta alive in the arena. None of the tributes knew what had happened to Araminta in the hospital. After a little while, Aphenia came into the room. She didn't dare tell Anya what had happened to Araminta, opting to give Anya some advice about the upcoming games instead. After a few minutes, Aphenia sighed and hugged Anya before pushing her into her launch tube and watching the glass close around her. As the glass closed, Anya put her hair up into a ponytail. Finally, in Achilles' launch room, Achilles paced back and forth, ready for the games. As soon as Maximus came into the room, Achilles asked him how Araminta was doing, honestly hoping she didn't make it. Maximus noticed this, but still opted not to tell Achilles anything about Araminta's condition. This disappointed Achilles, but he did listen in on what Maximus did tell him. After a few minutes, Maximus pushed Achilles into his launch tube and watched the glass close around him as Achilles scowled. When the 6 to 12 tributes rose into the arena, they were met with an arena that would come to be known as the Deadly Colorful Valley. As the tributes looked around, President Tobias Flickerman came onto the hologram on top of the cornucopia. He announced that due to the fight that occurred yesterday, Araminta had passed away in the night due to her injuries inflicted by the evil Almenio Vizier. This caused a few tributes to scream. Even Anya stepped back in fear. Meanwhile, some tributes, including Achilles and Archibald, thought that this was good as it meant there was one less tribute to worry about. As the countdown begins, Anya and Achilles find each other, and Achilles finally shows some team spirit, giving Anya a reassuring nod. As for Delara and Delaro, they were scared that they would be targeted, as their mentor had killed a tribute. As the pair found each other across the cornucopia from each other, they gave each other scared looks. As for Archibald, he looked around for the other careers. He only could find the 12s at this point, as both of them were on either side of him. He signaled to the 12s that he would target Ronan. This worried the 12s, but they signaled that they would help Archibald. Finally, as for Ronan and Charlotte, they found each other almost immediately, as they were right next to each other. Ronan gave Charlotte a reassuring smile and asked her to help him in the bloodbath. Charlotte nodded and agreed to this. When the gong sounded, Archibald ran into the cornucopia with Lombaria and Retro, along with Ronan and Charlotte. Archibald grabbed a sword, while Lombaria grabbed a pickaxe and Retro grabbed a spear. Archibald then ran over to Ronan. Wow, I messed up there. Who was fighting with the boy from 6 for a bag of oranges. When Archibald got to Ronan, he hit Ronan over the head with the blunt end of his sword, causing him to let go of the bag and fall to the ground. As the boy from 6 ran away, Archibald stood over Ronan. Ronan begged Archibald for mercy when it was evident that Archibald wouldn't give him mercy. Ronan shouted Charlotte's name. When Charlotte noticed what was happening, she ran towards the pair, but Lombaria and Retro got in between Charlotte and the boys. Archibald smirked and stated that the career alliance would always be better than the wannabe anti-careers. Archibald then plunged his sword down into Ronan's neck, sounding his cannon immediately. This caused Charlotte to scream and run away from the cornucopia. After killing Ronan, Archibald looked around for more kills. He saw Achilles and Anya fighting the pair from 11, and saw Delara fighting the boy from 6 over a warhammer. The action in the cornucopia was clearly dying down, and Archibald didn't like this. The only 3 tributes left that weren't fighting were him, Lombaria, and Retro. This gave Archibald an idea, and he ran at Lombaria. Archibald plunged his sword directly into Lombaria's neck, killing her instantly. This angered Retro, and he ran at Archibald. This initiative from Retro made Archibald laugh. Retro was only 6, and definitely weaker than Archibald at the beginning. As Retro jumped over a large rock and punched Archibald in the face, this newfound strength surprised Archibald. The boys fought for a surprisingly long time, both of them receiving dangerous wounds. At the end of the fight, it was ultimately, and surprisingly, Retro, who had won the fight, stabbing Archibald in the heart with his spear. Meanwhile, as Delara and the boy from 6 fight over the Warhammer they both wanted, the boy from 6 got on top of Delara and started to choke her out. Just before she would lose consciousness, Delara managed to reach the Warhammer and grab it, swinging it into the side of the boy's skull, knocking him off of her. Delara then got up and used all of her remaining strength to swing the Warhammer down onto the boy's head, squashing the boy from 6's head like a grape. Delara then fainted. As Delara noticed this, he grabbed a water bottle and a bag of oranges on the outskirts of the cornucopia before grabbing Delara and the Warhammer, carrying Delara away from the cornucopia. Meanwhile, Achilles and Anya fought the pair from 11. Achilles swung his knife at the boy from 11, while Anya used nunchucks to beat the life out of the girl from 11. As Achilles stabbed the boy from 11 in the heart, he looked over at Anya as she smacked her nunchucks into the side of the girl from 11's skull over and over and over again until her cannon sounded as well. After these kills were made, the careers grouped back up and they watched the final few outliers run away from the cornucopia. Retro was limping majorly, but the group paid it no mind, and as Jeremy tried to give Retro a medkit, Retro smacked it away, saying that his wounds weren't that bad, and that he was just happy he killed the traitor. After this, the Alliance talked about who the new leader of the Career Alliance should be, all agreeing that the leader should be Achilles. Meanwhile, in the launch rooms of the 60-plus games, as the mentors walked past each other, they whispered to each other their plans for saving Elmenio. The person who started this plan was later revealed to be Ophelia Bell, the capital-appointed mentor for the D3 female and future wife of Elmenio. In Archon's launch room, he looked scared. Although he had a huge alliance, bigger than any other alliance present in the arena, Archon was still scared, as most of the members of the Career Alliance seemed far stronger than himself, including Castor, Lake, Lisbetta, Hux, and Ren. Eventually, Urban came into Archon's room and talked with him about the fact that he had just as much of a chance at victory as all the other careers. Archon doubted this, but he didn't say anything and just stepped into his launch tube, waiting to be lifted into the arena. Meanwhile, in Cameo's launch room, Cameo wasn't really scared. He still felt nothing, feeling weak and numb after the loss of his friend and ally, Disney. Cameo sighed and sat down somewhere until Lydia came into the launch room. Lydia tried her best to comfort Cameo while also talking strategy with him. Cameo then muttered that he didn't care and that they were all gonna die anyways. Lydia tried to tell Cameo to not give up, but he already had. Eventually, Lydia pushed Cameo into his launch tube, watching the glass close around him. In Finch's launch room, Finch paced back and forth until Sadie came into the room. When Sadie arrived, she stated how proud she was of Finch's growth over the past few days, to which Finch replied that she was proud of Sadie's growth as a person as well. Sadie smiled and hugged Finch tight, hoping she wouldn't die in the arena. After a little while, Sadie pushed Finch into her launch tube and watched as the glass closed around her. In Ant-Man's launch room, he looked at the arena clothing offered. He looked intently before realizing that this looked like the outfit that patients in the old folks' home near his house would wear. This caused Ant-Man to correctly guess the arena before Phineas came into the launch room. Ant-Man looked at Phineas and smiled, asking him if he had seen the arena yet. Phineas would laugh and state that he had seen it, but he wasn't going to tell Ant-Man what it was. Antiman then smiled and stated that he figured he already knew anyways, but this didn't change the fact that Phineas wasn't gonna tell him what the arena was. After a little while of joking, Antiman stepped into his launch tube, preparing for the games ahead of him. In Lula's launch room, she too looked at the arena clothing offered and sighed when she recognized the outfit. She was not visited by anyone in her launch room, as both Sadie and Phineas were busy with Finch and Antiman. Lula was ready for the games, anyways, or so she thought. Eventually, she was instructed to get into her launch tube by peacekeepers, and Lula nodded before stepping into her tube, watching the glass close around herself. In Isabella's launch room, Isabella paced back and forth, waiting for Cressida. When Cressida arrived, she smiled at Isabella before stating that she reminded her of her grandma. Isabella giggled at this and hugged Cressida. Cressida happily returned this hug. The hug continued until the tributes were called into their tubes. Cressida smiled and pushed Isabella into her tube and watched the glass close around her. Cressida's reassuring smile stayed on her face until Isabella was out of sight. Cressida then burst into tears as she left the launch room. Finally, in Norman's launch room, Norman paced back and forth, preparing for the games. As Crassus came into the room, he immediately hugged Norman. During this hug, Crassus told Norman that he had to do whatever he could to win and reunite with Charlotte. Norman would nod at this, while thinking of what Charlotte would think if he had died in the arena. After a few minutes of talking strategy, Crassus pushed Norman into his tube and watched as the glass closed around him. He, too, kept a reassuring smile on his face until Norman was out of sight, bursting into tears that were definitely more intense than Cressida's were. As the tributes were lifted into the arena, they noticed they were inside. This is when Antiman realized he was right in assuming that the arena was inside of an old folks' home this year. As the tributes looked around, the commentators, Benji Triton and Katie Flickerman, joked that this arena was a very fitting arena for the oldies to fight in. As the countdown began, Cameo and Archon found their allies, and Cameo signaled that he would target Isabella, while Archon signaled he would target Norman. Nerva, who was one of only 3 careers who had seen Cameo and Archon's signals, signaled that she would target Della. Meanwhile, Antiman, Lula, and Finch found each other on opposite sides of the cornucopia. They then looked around and saw most of their allies. Finally, Isabella and Norman found each other rather quickly, being right next to each other. Isabella and Norman both agreed to run away from the cornucopia, hoping that the careers would be too preoccupied with the other alliance to attack them. When the gong sounded, the careers, minus Archon and Cameo, ran into the cornucopia. Meanwhile, Archon and Cameo noticed that Isabella and Norman were trying to run. The pair from one grabbed weapons on the outskirts of the cornucopia before swiftly catching up with the pair from 14. Cameo tackled Isabella to the ground. Isabella's head hit the ground so hard that she went unconscious, and all Cameo had to do was bring the knife he had grabbed down on her head, sounding her cannon. Meanwhile, Archon tackled Norman to the floor. Norman had a bit more fight in him, punching Archon in the chest before Archon stabbed Norman in the throat, sounding his cannon. As Archon and Cameo stood up, they looked towards the cornucopia, where Nerva had successfully killed Della. When Archon and Cameo arrived back at the cornucopia, All the other outliers had escaped the cornucopia. As the couriers counted their kills and Retro admitted to killing Archibald in order to avenge Lombaria, a cannon was heard in the distance. This cannon was revealed to belong to the girl from 8 after being found and killed by Barlon from 9. This cannon caused the couriers to pause what they were doing, with Anya and Achilles wondering who the cannon belonged to. Just then, another cannon sounded. Anya and Achilles wondered who the cannon belonged to until they heard Blue, Dove, and Fern all screaming. It turned out that Retro's wounds were more deadly than he had thought. As Anya and Achilles looked at the couriers, they saw Retro's dead body and sighed, muttering that Retro should have accepted the medical help that Jeremy was trying to give him. Meanwhile, back in the old folks' home, as the couriers tallied their kills, Archon was still having problems catching his breath after the punch to his chest from Norman. As Cameo gloated about his kill of Isabella and Nerva gloated about her kill of Della, Archon fell to the ground, finding it terribly hard to breathe. The other couriers gathered around Archon as he coughed, being unable to catch his breath. Eventually, Archon loses consciousness, causing Maitoka and Rin to jump into action. Maitoka and Rin tried their hardest to resuscitate Archon, giving him CPR, but this would not work as Archon's cannon would sound just seconds later. This would actually cause most of the career lives to break down and get emotional. Some Capitalites argued that this made it seem as though they weren't real careers, while others thought that this made them seem more like tributes they could root for. Back in the colorful alley, the careers talked about their lives back in their respective districts. Jeremy talked about how his mother worked as a paramedic at the horse races that the district holds. This interested all the careers, especially Anya and Achilles. The pair from 2 happily talked with the pair from 10 for hours. Meanwhile, with the anti-careers, Charlotte cried over the loss of Ronan. She was all alone until the trio from 15 found her. Vincent asked Charlotte where Ronan was, to which she replied that he was dead, before continuing to cry. Sophie and Catherine would hug Charlotte and let her cry on their shoulder until Delara, Delaro, Don, and Cosmo arrived where the rest of the group was. The anti-careers all comforted Charlotte as she continued to cry. The group was hoping that no one was hearing Charlotte's crying. This continued until they heard someone kick a stone nearby. This caused the entire group, even Charlotte, to go silent as they looked in the direction the sound came from. Just then, the boy from 4, Current, jumped out of the shadows and tackled Vincent to the ground. He immediately plunged his trident into Vincent's heart, sounding his cannon. Current then looked at the others with a smirk on his face. He then stated that he was going to be the youngest career victor ever. He then turned towards the other tribute nearest to him, Dawn. He tackled Dawn to the ground and quickly stabbed his trident into her stomach, sounding her cannon immediately. This caused the other careers to scream and get into action. Delara grabbed her warhammer and Charlotte grabbed a knife that Sophie had grabbed from the cornucopia. Delara then whacked Curran over the head with the warhammer, knocking him unconscious. Delara then let Charlotte take the kill. Charlotte stood over Current and glared down at him. She then looked around at the dead bodies of Vincent and Dawn, and then looked back at the unconscious body of Current. She glared down for a few more moments before getting on top of Current and bringing her knife down onto Current's neck, sounding as cannon. When the couriers heard all these cannons, they couldn't help but theorize who the cannons could have belonged to. Meanwhile, Achilles did the math and realized that there were still 20 tributes remaining, including the career alliance he found himself in. Later that night, Achilles and Anya decided to go hunt for tributes. After leaving the group, Achilles led Anya through the valleys of the arena, and eventually they found someone, or rather, a group of somebodies. The pair of careers found the outlier group, composed of Indiana from 6, Felt from 8, Panatena from 9, Tef from 9, and Barlon from 9. As Achilles and Anya stumbled into the outlier camp, Tef took Panatena and they ran to hide somewhere, which is what they had all planned out together in order to keep Panatena safe. Meanwhile, Barlon, Indiana, and Felt stayed to combat Achilles and Anya. Achilles ran at Barlon while Anya ran at Felt. When Anya tackled Felt to the ground, he actually managed to defend himself quite well, to the point where Anya actually feared for her life. Before Achilles could plunge his sword into Barlon's heart, he heard Anya scream, followed by her cannon. This distracted Achilles long enough for Barlon to kick him off of him. As this occurred, Achilles noticed he might not be able to beat these outliers, and so he began to run away. Before Achilles could get too far, though, Indiana grabbed her bow and arrow and skillfully shot Achilles, sounding his cannon. Meanwhile, back at the old folks' home, people were dropping like flies, surprisingly, to the capital. First was Lake. He died of a combination of certain things that he went into the arena with, including lung cancer, old age, and a major sickness. This sickness spread throughout some of the careers, killing both Nerva and Carla. As these 3 bodies fell, another cannon was heard in the distance, as Lula's old age took her life. This terrified most of Lula's allies as they began panicking, even causing Odo to faint. Finally, Cameo looked out in the distance. He didn't feel well at all. He felt terrible, both emotionally and physically. Both of his friends from his home district were dead, and he thought he had caught Lake's sickness. Cameo didn't want the sickness to spread to the other careers, and so he made the executive decision to take his own life and put himself out of his misery. He ended up slitting his own throat, sounding his cannon. In the span of an hour, 5 tributes died. 3 to sickness, 1 to old age, and 1 to suicide. This made the tributes that remained scared. As Finch and Anti-Man talked with the other anti-careers, another cannon was heard in the distance. This cannon was revealed to belong to Sentinel, after he had turned on the careers out of fear and got killed almost immediately by Castor. But not before Sentinel managed to gravely injure Maitoka. At midnight, another cannon sounded, this one belonging to Maitoka, after she succumbed to her injuries inflicted on her by Sentinel. The remaining career members gave her a proper burial, much like Katniss had done to Rue during the 74th Hunger Games. Meanwhile, back in the Colorful Valleys, the anti-careers watched the careers in the open cornucopia. Charlotte noticed that the careers friends from 2 hadn't returned yet. They heard something directly behind them. As they turned around, they caught Indiana as she was trying to sneak up on them. As Indiana paused in her tracks, Felt and Barlon jumped out from behind large rocks they were hidden behind. Indiana then smirked and pulled out her bow, shooting Cosmo in the heart, sounding as cannon. This angered the anti-careers, and Sophie tackled Indiana to the ground. The girls fought long and hard, both taking hard blows, but Sophie eventually wins the fight, plunging her knife into Indiana's stomach. As this fight was occurring, the couriers saw it from the cornucopia but decided not to intervene, wanting to know who would win. Meanwhile, back on the top of the hill, after Sophie had killed Indiana, Felt ran in and tackled Sophie to the ground. Before he could do anything, however, Catherine kicked Felt off of Sophie and began to choke him out. As Barlon watched this, he went into action. He tackled Delaro to the ground and immediately plunged his scythe into Delaro's stomach, sounding his cannon. This freaked everyone out, but Catherine didn't stop choking Felt out until his cannon had sounded as well. Catherine then got up and glared at Barlon, causing Barlon to run away in terror. By the end of day 1, only 14 tributes remained in the 6-12 arena. These tributes were all members of alliances. The Career Alliance still consisted of Blair from 1, Brass from 1, Blue from 4, Dove from 7, Fern from 7, Lisa from 10, and Jeremy from 10. The Anti-Career Alliance still consisted of Delara from 3, Charlotte from 14, Catherine from 15, and Sophie from 15. Finally, the Outlier Alliance still consisted of Penitena, Tef, and Barlon, all from 9. Meanwhile, the 60-plus arena was already down to the top 10 after the first day. These tributes were also all members of alliances. The Career Alliance still consisted of Castor from 2, Eucalyptina from 7, Figs from 7, Lisbetta from 10, Hux from 10, and Rin from 12. Finally, the Anti-Career Alliance still consisted of Finch from 5, Antimen from 5, Tessera from 9, and Odo from 15. So yeah, guys, that is the end of Part 3, The Arena. Come back next week for Part 4. If you guys enjoyed Part 3, then be sure to slap that like button. And as always, stay awesome. Good. Bye, everybody.